still in the country, according to a research conducted by the South African Medical Research Council and its partners, which draws a correlation between the way in which the biological, environmental, medical, social, behavioral, and geographical effects of extreme heat exposure have in Africa. The report shows that a high adverse of impact on mobility and mortality is in the most vulnerable communities in Africa. Its data states that infants, the elderly, persons living with disabilities, pregnant women, outdoor workers, and those who are on chronic medications were identified as the people most vulnerable to deaths as a result of exposure to extreme heat. The research comes following the death of 8 farm workers who succumbed to heat wave in Northern Cape in South Africa. Its aim is to provide a synthesis of Africa-informed evidence on the effects of extreme heat on mobility and mortality on the continent. The research also complements the impact of extreme heat on mortality and mobility and coping mechanisms related to indoor and outdoor temperatures among households. Of course, you're still watching News Central now. To speak more on the research and current effects of the heat wave going on in South Africa, we're joined by senior specialist scientist at the South African Medical Research Council, Karadi Wright. Thanks for joining us, Ms. Wright. Now, what can you tell us about the current heat wave going on in South Africa and also the research that was done?
Thank you for having me. The heat wave that we are seeing across many parts of South Africa at the moment is what we start to see more commonly occurring in South Africa. Intense heat waves with higher temperatures than we've experienced before for more days. So in other words, the frequency of the event is getting higher and the intensity of the event is becoming higher. And this is a direct impact of global warming. In Southern Africa, we are projected to see temperatures increase on average by 4 to 6 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. And accompanying that are these periods of extreme heat and heat wave, as we've seen an unfortunate number of deaths in the Northern Cape a few days ago. And the research that we've been working on is to get a better understanding of what are the risks that heat poses, especially to the South African population.
Now, let's talk about the mentioned groups, that the ones that were spoken about in the research. What makes them more vulnerable?
So certain groups are predisposed to being susceptible to heat impacts. For example, children and infants. They can't look after themselves and they require somebody else to look after them. And in this instance, it's really important that the care providers or the teachers give these small children plenty of water, try and encourage them to stay in the shade, try and make sure that they have enough space where they can play that isn't in the direct sun, for example. Other groups who we are concerned about are the elderly, as well as people who work outdoors. These people may be exerting themselves, doing heavy work and lifting, and maybe wearing clothing that isn't necessarily cool to help regulate their body temperature.
Over time, there have been arguments that Africa, doesn't contribute that much to global warming, and so there may not be enough conversations concerning the heat wave in Africa and climate change and some of all of that. So can you quickly speak on that? Do you think that the continent and, those of us here on the continent are worried enough about, global warming and the heat wave year after year?
Yeah, so I think you have a very good point. When we talk about mitigation of the impacts of global warming from African continent, it's a very difficult subject because Africa has probably contributed least to the effects of greenhouse gas emissions compared to more developed, higher income countries in the past. And at the same time, the African continent is on a development trajectory. We would really like to grow and give our people the best quality of life that we can. So going forward, it's going to be very important that we recognize that we are going to be experiencing warming temperatures and more heat waves, and we have to raise awareness among all of our communities to take the best possible action that they can within their means, of course.
All right, and of course, if you look at the geographical location of South Africa, It might be fair to argue that there are other parts of the continent that might have, worse temperatures. So let's talk about, how, you expect that it should play out in other parts of the continent. South Africa and its geographical location compared to other parts of the continent that have, worse heat recorded every year.
Yes, of course. So the countries around the equator are especially at risk of increasing heat. Those countries already do experience a lot of heat. So in terms of the health risk, we aren't quite sure yet how populations will cope with the increasing heat that we see in those places. We're hoping that they will fare reasonably well because they have ways in which to self-regulate and cool and live to try and create a cooler environment. But it is, of course, a concern because we don't know exactly how hot it's going to become. And of course, there will become a point where it's just too difficult to do ordinary daily things like work outside to earn an income.
Cardi Wright, thank you so much for your time. Great to speak with you and looking forward to speaking with you again.
Thank you.